A wind that tasted of iron and old snow woke him as if some far bell had struck his name. He opened his eyes under carved eaves he did not know, and moonlight lay on water like broken silver. Somewhere above, an elven voice ran bright and clear along a high hall, a thread of sound that belonged to stars rather than to men. Across the river, a horn answered, low and hollow, a toll that smelled of clean smoke and something older. It put Jon Snow's northern lungs to work before his mind could tell them why. He sat up slow, the habit of cold nights and sudden watches still in his muscles. The cloak about his shoulders was not black, but soft and embroidered with leaves. The air smelled of pine and beeswax and the sharp iron of cavalry saddles. His hands found a wooden rail carved with knotwork and trees. They knew the grain, but they did not know the maker. For a long moment, he simply listened. The song above, the quiet footfall of a ranger on the path, the distant toll of the horn that had pulled him from whatever dream had been stealing him back to a world of white walls and bitter wind. A ranger came then, a lean man with a bow and a face shadowed by a hood. He paused on the bridge and gave Jon a narrow, careful salute, the way men greet strangers whose hands might be as dangerous as their swords. His eyes were not unkind, only wary. He smelled faintly of river mud and smoke, as if he had ridden through a storm. Jon returned the salute because that was what men of his order did. He stood slowly, testing knees that felt years younger and more unfamiliar than his memory allowed. From the hall above, a voice called his name, a name old as Riverstone and foreign as the sea. Elrond came down those carved steps with a patience that seemed to slow the world. He was not the brittle scholar Jon had half imagined. He moved like a man who had once been a long road. He looked on Jon as if on a clue in a book, and his hands were folded as one who had listened long at a door. There was no surprise in his face, only the grave welcome of someone who thought even strangers might be part of a larger design. Elrond spoke with a quiet that commanded attention. "You came in a night wind," he said, and his words were measured like stones placed in a bridge. "There are other winds also. The south grows restless. A shadow that was thought far has begun to creep again." His voice did not need to say the name of the thing that bent men's wills. The shape of worry in the hall said it for him. A story older than any of Jon's oaths pulsed faintly through the timbers, the tale of a darkness that had been beaten back only once. Jon's answer was small and honest. "I woke. I rode. I don't know where I am." He spoke like a man who had been schooled in short truth. The ranger's hooded companion watched him, as if cataloging scars, not expecting many. "You carry a weight," Elrond observed. "It sits in your shoulders like armor." He sounded neither cruel nor pitying. He merely named what was. Plain to see, the posture of a commander without command, the set of a man who would take responsibility, because otherwise no one would. Acceptance came dressed as hospitality. Jon was shown a room warmed with woven rugs and small hearth globes that smelled faintly of beeswax. A cup placed in his hand held a drink that tasted of autumn apples and made the edges of his memory sharper. Elrond offered counsel with the careful hand of someone who had tended many crises. News first, then judgment. "You are come at a turning," he said. "We have scouts to the east and messengers beyond the mountains. The hosts of the south move as the moon does, slow and sure, and without mercy. Gondor sends word of stirrings at the borders. The dark marshes give off a breath this season like an animal risen. Jon drank and listened. Words, when they were not orders shouted across a courtyard, sounded strange and precious. He found himself thinking in watchwords and formations, in the small mercies that kept lines unbroken. The memory of the wall rose in him like a living thing, the long, cold vigil, the frost that etched names into faces, the way men learned to stand when night came and did not know what shade would come with it. That was where he had learned to take charge. That was where anonymity had been a lie at the wall. No man was truly nameless because duty named him daily. Elrond unfurled a map that smelled faintly of old ink. The lands were drawn in soft strokes, rivers like threads, mountain teeth, broad fields where shadows gathered. He spoke of marches in the south, columns of men and worse, banners that carried sigils like black palm prints in the sun. The shadow gathers under a single will, Elrond said. It seeks to remake what is free into a single net. There is a hand to this shadow that would take all and bind it. He did not say Sauron, he did not have to. The word hung in the space like a blade. A messenger had arrived at dawn, he said, breathless and stained with dust. He had ridden from the direction of Gondor. His tale was thin but urgent. Towns that looked to the east for trade reported riders bent on violence, and strange banners had been seen among the hills. Whatever stirred was pushing toward the heartland. Elrond's face showed the old care of a lord who keeps a house because many small lives depend on his steadiness. We cannot hold alone, he said simply. Jon's hands tightened around the cup. He felt a familiar ache then, the need to move, to set men in order, and to walk at the head of them. It was not hunger for glory. He had seen what glory took. It was a stubborn, cold thing like winter's promise, to protect what lay behind him, even if it cost him himself. He had never chosen to be a leader. Men had pushed him forward because he would not step back. The wall had taught him to answer peril with lines of men and to take the worst of it for others. Elrond watched him and said, "You who have kept a long watch, you who have learned to bend your will to harsh things. If you would take up a road, you will need more than your sword." He set beside the map small tokens, a chain of command in the form of messengers, a plan for allies to be sought in strange places. There are those who will trust a blade and those who will trust a vow. You will need both. His tone had the solemnity of someone passing on a torch that was heavy and hot. Jon thought of the wall's clasped hands, of brothers who had frozen at his side, of the half-mad courage of men who put themselves between the world and the dark. He thought of home, not the place of those who had given him name, but the place of people who trusted him. He remembered Lyanna's laugh like a half-remembered song in a dream. That memory stung, then steadied. "If I ride south," he said, "not as a question but as a choice, I will be no shadow's cloak. I will make men stand together as one blade." The words felt blunt and true on his tongue. Elrond inclined his head. The elf's age did not bend him to sentiment. "Do not think to bind proud folk with a single hand," he warned him as a gardener warns a weathered tree. "Gondor has its own pride. The northern folk have their grudges. Yet between pride and ruin is the narrowest path. Mercy will be as necessary as iron." His counsel fell like rain on a field that had already been plowed, useful, inevitable, and likely to stir more growth than one expected. The hall hummed with a soft life as plans and doubts were laid on the table. Jon listened to the names of places he did not know and to the cadence of old borders. He felt the map's lines like ribs under flesh. He had been a steward of little, a wall of men, a strip of land, the small justice of a watchman's call. Here the scale was wider, the stakes greater, but the core was the same. Men broke when they felt alone. Men endured when someone stood with them. He knew how to stand. At dawn he took a horse that smelled of riverwood and iron. He wrapped himself in a cloak Elrond lent him, one that would carry no banner, but that might shelter decisions. There was a silence in the hall as he left that was more eloquent than any blessing. Rangers and elves and servants watched him go, some with hope, others with the cool civility of those who have seen many leave and few return. He passed beneath carved eaves, and the last notes of the elven song clung to him like a scent. He did not look back. He had slept in a strange bed and been fed at a stranger's table, and that hospitality had been fragile and perfect. It had been an island of light. He swung into the saddle with the long, steady motion of a man who has learned to rise in cold dawns. The river beside Rivendell murmured, and the tolling of the black horn was a dark bell behind him. He felt the weight of command settle again across his shoulders like a familiar cloak. As the green of the valley fell away beneath his boots, thought settled into action. He would ride for Gondor. He would carry no claim but the one that duty gave, to bind those who stood alone and make them face the shadow together. The road would be long. The faces he would meet would be set in their own iron. Yet a man who had watched the wall knew the value of small kindnesses and strict orders alike. He set his jaw and spurred the horse south, carrying with him the fragile counsel of elves and the cold certainty of northern resolves. The world before him spread wide and dangerous. He had chosen a path that would either bend to God or burn what he loved to ash. He did not pretend to know which. He only knew he could not unchoose it now. They watched him as if he were a thing washed up from a far sea. The captains of Gondor clustered behind the hooped banners, faces mapped with the austerity of men who had long borne a steward's grief. Their mouths were thin, their hands rested where swords would be. Jon Snow stood beneath the white tower's shadow, his cloak still damp with other storms, and felt their suspicion like a blade at his ribs. He had words to answer with, and no words would quiet the watching. So he lifted his chin and offered them a different proof. "I will ride with your scouts," he said. His voice carried no artifice. It was the voice of one who had eaten cold bread and given away his cloak. "Let me show you what I mean upon the road." They measured him anew. One of the captains asked for oath and sigil, names and sworn fealty. The city had rules. A stranger could not simply take command where blood and law held sway. Jon spoke something older than those laws. He spoke of deeds that would be set like iron between men and memory. He promised not to bind their banners under a strange name. He promised instead his arm for a single venture into the lowlands, where the black wings had darkened the dawn. The captain's eyes still narrowed. A risk demanded a risk in return. So the bargain was cast. If he returned with living men and no greater sorrow upon Gondor than before, he might keep his place among them. If he fell or failed, he would be sent to the roads, and the songs would call him what they would. They put him in a small company, 30 mounted, a handful of foot to hold the rear. The stewards lent him an old war horse with flanks scarred like a traveler's hand. The saddle creaked as if complaining. Dawn was thin and gray when they rode down from the stone into earth, scented by river and marsh. The men of Gondor were steady. Their armor had seen siege and river flood. There was an economy to their movement. Jon watched them. He learned their rhythm and let his own pulse match it. He noticed the little things soldiers always notice: how many spurs had been worn, which harness straps were mended with wire, which faces bore the wide cuts of sleepless watch. These were people who read danger in habit. They crossed the lowland road where grass grew knee-high and reeds whispered. Ahead, smoke had begun to stain the sky. The first sign was not a cry or the clatter of hooves, but the sudden hush of birds. They lifted as a single loose thing and fled. They did not return. The men tightened their reins, and the oiled mail made a soft, remorseful music. The smell reached them then, iron sharpened over burning wool, an old and bitter scent. It pricked at Jon's throat. He had smelled such things before: a war horse's fear, a town's burning, the cold breath of coming winter. The captain beside him cursed softly. "The Nazgul ride," he said. The word fell like ice on the dawn. They found the first ruin like a hand thrust from the earth. A farmstead lay pressed to the turf where smoke made a thinner sky. Straw coals had eaten through roofs. Carts were toppled like broken bones. Men crouched among the wreckage, eyes gleaming with a fear that had no name. A child sat on a threshing board, her hair curled with ash, and when she looked at Jon, she saw not a foreign lord, but simply someone who had not yet betrayed them. He dismounted and moved among the people, hands bare, offering water from his water skin. Small things quieted the immediate terror. The captain's men set a guard, and a sergeant cursed at the oddness of how all the dogs had fled. They did not tarry. The reports were worse on the road ahead. Men speaking in low voices told of riders like shadow with wings, of men whose faces were a hole inside a cloak. Hunger for name and for fear had driven some warriors to stand and look and not run. They had been taken. The Nazgul, Jon learned then, did not rely always on sights that eyes could mark. They brought a coldness that gnawed at courage and a voice that unmade resolve. Once that voice had called across a simple field, men had dropped their spears and knelt as if at a king's command. Jon felt something of that unmaking brush his mind as they rode. He remembered how terrified men could become like sheep, and how the saving of a day sometimes came down to who could stand when others turned. Word came that a rider had been seen atop a low knoll, black as a crow and taller than a man, directing men below as though shepherding wolves. Jon urged the horse forward. The company tightened ranks and crested the rise together, armor jangling like a measured heart. From the knoll they saw them, a band of marauders cut from the southward wilds, banners that were not Gondor's but darker, and above them the shadowed shapes wheeled and cut in the chill sky. The Nazgul's presence made the hair on Jon's forearms bristle, though he had never seen such a thing before. Their horses reared at the sound of it. Even the wind seemed to draw back its breath. The captain made ready to give command when Jon stepped forward. "Let me lead the right," he said. No plea. It was a man's order to a man. The captain hesitated, then nodded. The right flank moved like a wave, 30 men folding their spears and bearing down upon the marauders with a tempo learned in many nights of watch. Jon's mind worked in quick, clean facets. He ordered a feint to draw the band's eyes. He called for a small contingent to wheel and threaten the rear, and save the heavier blow for when the lighter men were engaged. His tactics were simple. Northern he trusted in the steadiness of men and the shock of coordinated steel. When the lines met, there was a smell of wet earth and leather and that brighter odor of horse. bodies met with a dull, decisive sound. Jon felt the rhythm of combat like a drum, a marauder's blade arced, bright against the gray dawn. Jon parried. His own steel took the strike, and the sound was not a scream, but a tearing hush. Around him, men shouted names and curse words, and the wind carried a scrap of prayer. But the true terror was not the steel, it was the sudden hush that rolled across the field as one of the winged riders came down low. Men's faces tightened, and their words failed mid-sentence. The Nazgul did not strike, it only hung in the air, and the men nearest it felt the cold like a living weight. One of the captain sergeants fell to his knees, his hand slackening on his spear. He trembled with a fear that was not of blade. The marauders took him as if he were already part of a harvest. Jon saw the motion and moved as if he had no thought but the next right act. He ran across open ground, his cloak flapping, and reached the sergeant. He thrust his own body between the fallen man and the unseen voice that sought to claim him. He shouted, not a formal cry, but a plain, sharp sound that cut the hush. The words had no sorcery, only human heat. The sergeant looked up, blinking as one wakes from a long sleep. Jon's hand found his shoulder and shook him until he cursed and spat. The spell of the Nazgul was not broken by swords alone. It could be countered by the stubbornness of living touch. That stubbornness bought time. The captain's flank closed on the marauders, and a new violence filled the little hollow. Swords sang, shields banged, and the ground took new stains which the grass would later hide. The Nazgul circled higher, as if deliberating. When it dropped again, it struck not with claw or blade, but with an immense inward pressure. Men collapsed as if a winter wind had stepped into their ribs. Horses reared and then lay still. The marauders fled in confusion. A feeling like a thin fog crept toward the men who stood. Two of the captain's riders had already sat down upon the grass and would not stand. Jon saw one reach with a trembling hand to his breast and clutch at his own name as if he might hold it tight, and the other simply lay still with the eyes open and blank. Steel was of less use against that force. A bow cracked a spear, found meat. But the Nazgul's real weapon was the mind and the will of men. Jon felt his own resistance tested. A memory rose of long nights on the wall where men feared wildings and worse things in the dark. He drew breath and let the memory stand for something firmer, a memory that told him to hold. He shouted for trumpets, and a raw, uncertain note blew from the captain's horn. It was not a call to rout. It was a call that said, "Here, we still stand." Then another force made itself known. From the trees at the field's edge, a small company poured, woodsmen of a different strain, faces smeared with ash and leaves clinging to their hair. They ran like something out of the earth. Their leader, a woman with a braid like woven iron, caught Jon's eye and gave him a nod that would have passed for greeting in other times. She bore no sigil of Gondor. Her presence was a wild card that had not been counted. She loosed a flight of javelins with a fierce cheer that rang against the drear note of the Nazgul. The shadow above twisted as if in annoyance. For a breath, the wind seemed to shift in favor of the living. The captain turned his head and met Jon's gaze. There was no triumph there yet, only the brief knowledge that his question had been answered in part. Jon breathed hard. The world at that moment was a place of collision, of black wings and human stubbornness, of rotting will and the quick loyalty that comes when one man will not watch another die. He could see the calculation in the captain's eye. Send him away now, and perhaps The next such assault would find them alone and hollow, keep him, and his strange courage might yet be an ally or a cruel bargain. Jon's own decision pressed upon him like a physical thing. He had not come to Gondor to be a curiosity. He had come because he had been told to stand where danger lay and to choose. He stepped from the press of men and made for the knoll where the leader of the marauders had posted himself, the man who waved the black banner as though it were a spear. Each step felt like laying down a pact. Jon had no magic to throw at the Nazgul, no ring to put away, only the steadiness of his arm and the warmth of touch that had once roused a collapsing friend. He passed the captain's hand against the shoulder of a soldier and bid him hold the line. He looked up and saw the winged rider turn, as if sensing that a new kind of courage had mounted the field. The Nazgul's shadow fell heavier, and at that very instant Jon knew the fight he had chosen would ask for more than muscle. It would ask for his name and the steadiness of a heart that could hold against the unmaking. The air tightened. The next move would not wait. The riding ground lay like a wound of turned earth beneath a cold sun, horses stamping in a dust that smelled of sweat and oats and the bitter tang of iron. Jon walked between ranks with his fur cloak thrown back so that the men of the north might see the sigil stitched upon his breast and the readiness in his face. Around him, the Rohirrim moved as if they had always been born to the plain long reins looped between their fingers, spears held like the straight spines of some great fish. Their horses tossed their heads, nostrils flaring, ears flicking at sounds the northerners could not hear. Theoden watched from a low rise, his hand on the pommel of a sword that gleamed like a promise. He spoke little, but his eyes measured the man before him and the steel in him. Jon's plan was plain and without ornament. The horse lords would shape thunder, and sweep the northern foot would be the hedge of iron that halted any who tried to break the charge. They would not merely ride and stall, they would weave. Riders would fall back as shieldmen advanced, creating lanes for the cavalry to pass through, then close like shutters behind them. When the Rohirrim charged again, they would find spears planted thick as a forest, poles bristling from hedge lines, men shoulder to shoulder to catch their momentum and turn it. It was an old idea dressed in new clothing, cavalry and pike, hoof and shield, a rhythm of advance and anchor that made both parts stronger than either alone. The first pass was a test more of temper than of tactics. A dozen riders broke into a run, wind rising like a river around them, the earth a thunder that made the very air tremble. Northerners in mail and fur held ground as if rooted, eyes narrowed against the sun and dust. They did not flinch when the thunder passed. Men on horseback sought a gap and drove through with hooves that hammered and a cry that cut the plain like a blade. Spears rose, quick, practiced, and the riders learned to ride the spaces, to slip between ranks with reins gripped stiffly, to make their spurs a part of the beat. Jon rode at the head, his hand low on a pommel, feeling the cadence of both horse and shield. He found the moment where speed met solidity, and for one bright heartbeat, the two separate things became one. They did not merely survive, they learned. The Rohirrim modified their lines, thinning or thickening at Jon's gesture. Northerners altered their step, taking the sting of dust to find a safer footing. Where riders faltered, shieldmen filled the gap where shieldmen wavered. Riders knelt and used their seats to brace them. Horses smelled the fear of the first pass, and then, curiously, the calm after. Children of the court and the camp watched from the edges, faces lifted, mouths open at the sound of such a thing as harmony being made on a field. After the second charge, Theoden laughed, a sound like iron on stone. He rose and called for wine. He moved with the old dignity of a man who had seen many winters and still loved the wildness of his people. "So the Northerners teach us steadiness," he said, to which Jon only answered with a nod. Eomer, if he had been present, a look of eager approval would have shone upon him. But the court's younger knights stepped forward instead, pressing questions and offers of maneuvers, dreaming already how such a thing could be brought to war. The air grew warm with talk and the banging of metal against wood as men checked harness and sharpened spear tips by habit. Night folded upon the camp with suddenness, as if the plain itself had pulled a dark cloth over its head. Fires were lit and lanterns hung, making pools of gold amid a sea of shadow. Music from the Rohirrim, low pipes and drum, wound among the tents. Northerners sat about their own fires, sharpening blades and speaking little. Jon moved between them all, tasting the smoke and the strange peace of shared toil. He felt, for a handful of heartbeats, as if something had been mended, not just an alliance made, but an old loneliness stitched to new kinship. Men drank and toasted, making small oaths and larger boasts, until sleep took most of them like a thief in the night. It is always the smallest things that betray the biggest threats. A night raven, black as a starless hole, circled and circled once too often over the Allied camp. A scout returned with a face like a flayed thing, and the words that broke the night's makeshift calm. The enemy moved. Not a host vast as the plains might hold, but a wound of movement at the edge of the world, lightless riders, banners that crawled like oil, and something in the sound like many voices whispering at once. Sauron's servants do not come as polite heralds. They come like winter, all bit and knife. Theoden's face went hard, and the court fell silent as a held breath. He did not give orders so much as point them, and men leapt to them as if they had been trained to do so. Lanterns were snuffed. Fires were tamped down to embers. The camp folded inward like a palm closing. Jon tasted iron at the back of his tongue and smelled the wet fur of horses pressed to their haunches. Men moved with the precision of a thing that has practiced readiness for too long. Yet even in that hush, there was a clamor, sudden, fierce, the sound of beasts that do not belong to the light, hounds with too many teeth, and the sing-song shriek of a far-off horn. The attack came like a low wind that at first seemed only cold, and then became a gale of flame. From 3 quarters, it seemed, the enemy descended not in lines, but in frenzied knots. They struck the tents with torches and with hands that had no respect for metal or cloth. Horses leapt and screamed. A dozen men were up and out and into the dark within heartbeats, swords drawn and breath steaming white. Men of the north formed a thin circle, shields braced, lips pulled back, not in smiles, but in gritted determination. Rohirrim grabbed spears and axes, and they met the attackers in the close shadow of canvas and low flame. The clash was close enough that the scent of sweat and smoke braided together in the air. For a moment, the world narrowed to 1,000 small consequences. One torch caught a food sack, and a wave of heat rolled through the camp. A horse bolted, dragging a man who would not let go of his reins. The enemy did not wear the banners of men. There were no tones in their speech. They had the feel of wild beasts guided by a cruel hunger. Jon found himself pushing back one of them, an elongated shadow that moved wrong, and when the man fell, the light showed a face that had once been something like a man. and quickly was fragmenting as if rot had its own teeth and appetite. Jon looked away and said nothing aloud. His hands were busy with the weight of his sword. Theoden rode through the chaos with a controlled fury. He took a spear in the shoulder and kept riding, clutching a new sword in the other hand. He barked orders and steadied the men with short commands. A young rider saved a child whose wail had been muffled by smoke, carrying him clear of the flaring tents. Northerners dragged wounded onto blankets and found space for the dying as a kind of reverence, not an end. The Rohirrim, accustomed to meeting foe on wide plains, now met them in the close press, where spears were clumsy and swords sang truer. Where the enemy expected to scatter a camp, they found instead a single, concentrated will. There was blood, but not the kind of gory celebration that makes stories monstrous. It was the practical and sorrowful kind. Stained cloth, a dark blot near the jaw, a hand held for a moment too long, the tightening of a face, and then silence. It was, as always, the cost of keeping a promise, and the men who kept it felt the weight of that cost pressing at their chests. When the attackers finally broke like a net being ripped, they fled into the darkness with something like a scream that echoed as if from many throats. The Allied camp was burned in parts, several tents were lost, 3 men lay still, and more were broken in ways that would heal or would not. The Rohirrim had taken losses among their best horsekeepers. The North had lost a young sergeant whose laugh had been one of Jon's cruder comforts. In the gray hours before dawn, the chiefs gathered where the night still smelled of smoke. Theoden, his shoulder bared beneath a torn cloak, did not wrap his wound. He sat upon a stump and watched the men move as if they were figures on a map he could read by touch. Jon stood before him, rain of ash still on his hair, hands clasped. Around them the court and the captains formed a rough ring, their faces carved with exhaustion and a terrible attention. They did not speak at once. Around them the camp smelled of something old and unforgiving, iron, tar, and the faint perfume of life underneath the ash. Theoden's voice was low but unblinking. "We have stood together tonight," he said. "We stood because hands were put to task and shields to shelter. We stood because those who came had no right in our lands." He looked at Jon then, and there was not the patient distance of a king speaking to an envoy. There was instead the blunt honesty of a man asking another to join him on some long and dangerous road. "Will you ride for the West with us when the time comes? Are you bound to the cause in more than word?" Jon felt the tiredness like a thing physical, heavy as mail, but steadier than the beating of his heart. He thought of the men who had fallen, the child with eyes wide in the smoke, the sharpness of a spear that found its mark. He thought of the promise he had first made in colder places, and of a longing that had grown like a root to seek other earth. He stepped forward and took the hand offered him. Theoden's was warm and calloused, the clasp held both. They placed a finger to palm, nicked skin, and let the small warmth bloom. Each man around them did the same, a ring of hands that bled the smallest of blood and made it common. It was no dark ritual, no oath of shadow. It was a binding by the old way, to give a part of yourself where another needed it most. "Then we ride," Jon said, and his voice was worn but sure. "We ride for what remains unbroken. We do not ride for crowns or for glory, but to answer a thing that would make all things dark." Theoden nodded, and in the soft light a grim humor crossed his face. "Then let us put order to our grief and rid the world of this hunger, they did not speak of routes or the numbers of men or the exactness of siege. Those were things for maps and counting. What was decided in that smoke-scented hour was simpler and truer. They would take up each other's burdens and march as one. Men heated steel, steadied horses, and packed provisions into the pale morning. The camp burned but did not break. Flames were smothered and tents rebuilt with hands that had been quick in blood and deliberate in peace. By dawn, a new banner, fashioned from torn bits of both houses' cloth, was sewn and raised. It bore no sigil save for a crude pattern of interlocking spears and a horse's head, two kinds of strength stitched into one. As the sun lifted, painting the plain with thin gold, the Allied force set their faces eastward. They moved with a slow strictness, like a body gathering itself for a great stride. The attack had taken from them more than men it had stolen, that easy belief that threats would always be distant. The oath made in the small hours sat now like a steady stone in the chest. They rode not merely to avenge or to repel, but to find the root of that darkness and to strike. Behind them, the plain still smoldered ahead, lay unknown roads and the shadow of a name that had lain long across Middle-earth. The day opened, and with it came a march that would not stop until the bell of war rang or the last rider fell. The bowl of night had not yet left the white stones when Jon came back from the Palantir. He came not like a man who had been gifted, but like one who had been carved. Candlelight fell from waxen sconces and pooled on the flagstones, and the bowl's glass sat between folded cloths as if it had been put down by a guilty hand. Those who watched him, captains and old marshal, a pale figure with a staff, saw his face and fell silent. He moved with the careful, impatient gait of a man who has seen a map and must set the lines upon it. He smelled like cold iron and smoke, as if he had stood at the rim of some great furnace and breathed its breath. He did not speak at once. He walked the chamber's length and laid his palms upon the parapet as if to feel the city's bones. The voices that had been with him in that glass, brief, bright, terrible, still lingered behind his teeth. They had shown him rivers of flame, the angles of siege, the thin places where a host might slip past the enemy's eye. They had also given him a sound, a voice like wind over a plain of iron, low and sure, coaxing and cruel. Sometimes, at the edge of a thought, that voice would whisper a phrase and pull a loose thread from his sleep. He forced himself to breathe, to name kin and duty out loud, like a man laying hands upon his own heart. When a thing is seen, it must be named, Jon said finally. His words sank into the room as if he had thrown them into deep water. There are weak places in Mordor, gates old and unwatched, roads that think themselves hidden, towers that lean from ruin. The eye sees much, yet even the eye has blind corners. We can strike at those corners. The old marshal stepped forward then, his silver hair a pale ring in the torchlight. "You carry words from a peril not our own," he said. His voice was not unbelieving. It was the voice of one who had agreed to many hardships and still found his measure. "Tell us plainly. Where do we move?" Jon named bearings in a voice like flint, a valley where the blackness thinned, a ruined causeway behind the mountains, a hidden ford the Palantir had made clear as a wound. He pointed, and in his hand the air took on the shape of lines and camps. He said the names of two ruins. They were older than the language of the city, and with each syllable he watched for the effect upon those who listened. He had no proof to lay upon the table but his vision and his command. What he offered was a plan that would split their strength and send a spear into the flank of Sauron's legions. It was simple in its core and terrible in its price. "It will cost lives," Jon said without a pause. He kept his tone spare and blunt, like a man carving meat with a dull blade. "We will not march as one host. We will march in parts. Some columns will draw the eye. Some will move where footfalls are fewer. There will be raiding bands ahead, shadow soldiers to take alarms and burn watchfires. There will be a bridge of men across the Emyn. They will fight while the others go past. If Sauron turns his eye to the clatter, the other columns must be gone." A murmur. The pale figure with the staff, an old ally whose gray had been braided by wind and winter, tilted his head. "You would make martyrs," he said. His words did not indict Jon, they merely named a fact. "You would send men to tie a hand to the Lord of the Rings. Not martyrs," Jon spoke. "Choices, sacrificed by order, not by chance. We do not hide from the price. We pay it with eyes open." He looked at each face, soldier, priest, lord, letting the weight of the plan settle as if it were a stone upon each chest. "I will lead a column into the shadow. I will take the hardest task." Some in the chamber shifted. A captain of men, broad and scarred, asked what none of them wished to hear, but all needed to put plainly, "If your mind cracks beneath that glass, will you still command us? Will the Palantir turn you to another's?" Word, Jon met him squarely. He could feel the voice at the edge of his hearing like a second heartbeat. "It may try," he said. "It may show me what it wishes, and it will shape my sleep into its desires. But I have lived in the dark. I have looked at winter and kept looking. The thing that would steal a man's will must reckon with mine." His voice thinned then, honest and ragged. "I will carry it, so others may move." The old marshal's eyes narrowed to slits. "Men do not follow a prophecy," he said. "They follow a man who keeps his head." He moved as if to take up a gauntlet, though none lay upon the table. "Will you keep yours?" Jon's grip tightened on the parapet until his knuckles paled. "I will," he said, "and I will ask of you to trust what the glass showed, not its voice, but its lines. We will not leap blindly. We will make feints, build earthworks, send scouts that will not return unless ordered. We will choose where to bleed." Silence had weight. It was the old kind of silence, the one that is not empty, but full of counting, of men tallying sons and fathers and brothers against a cause. It could have broken any covenant. Instead, the captain with the scarred jaw stepped forward. He did not speak with long speeches. He said, "Then we march at dawn." And his voice was like a door closing. The choice made the plan grow teeth. Orders became timetables. Young clerks unrolled maps and traced routes with fingers that trembled at the first cold of night. The city hummed with a quieter fear. Now soldiers that had been idle took saddle and reins with an eagerness that was not joy, but the relief of having a shape to their dread. Carpenters were sent to the lower yards to mend wagons. Bowyers checked cords by lamplight. Food was parceled into tight bundles and strapped beneath saddles like a beast armor. A smith hammered into the night, and each strike sounded like a small iron promise. Jon walked among these preparations like one who had been summoned to weave them. He tasted the common smoke of the yards, felt the grain of ropes, listened to the muttered names men gave to places they had never seen. When a young ranger approached him with an ink-smeared hand, the man's voice was thin with worry. "There are folk from the north," he said. They will ride with us. They bring wolves and long knives." John's mouth lifted with something close to a smile. "Let them bring all they can," he replied. "We will need speed and a hiding tongue." Night moved toward dawn, and the city never fully slept. Lanterns bobbed like slow stars. From somewhere near the gate came the sound of horses shifting the metal ring of bridles. A line of banners, worn, patched, proud, was raised in the outer square, each sewn with emblems: a stag, a leaf, a tower. Under those cloths, men and elves, and a few from beyond the wide sea, stood in small knots, trying to keep warm and swap courage like a passing cloak. The air tasted of oats and iron and a faint sweetness brought by men who had been feeding 1,000 mouths. Against the white walls, long shadows pooled, and the city seemed to brace itself. John met with the lords before the columns formed. They stood in a circle under an arch where the world outside was a sliver of sky. The pale wizard placed his hand on the hilt of his staff and looked at John as one might examine a blade. "There will be a falling off," he said. "Not all will come through. That is the way with wars where you choose the small road." "Then those must be the bravest," John answered, "or the most tired of living a life only to keep another alive to die later." A lady of a people older than most named spoke then, and her voice lay like a bird on a windowsill, soft, sharp, and certain. "Old debts must be paid," she said. "The land remembers those who kept it whole. If you will walk into shadow, we will walk with you. But know this, Snow of another world, bargain with Sauron, and you bargain with a hunger that will not honor pacts. The Palantir showed you angles, its light is not wholly truthful. Use what it gives, but trust more in the strength of men and of the earth that holds them." John bowed his head to her as one soldier to a well-loved ally. He felt the glass as echoes in his chest like an animal coughing. He thought of winter, of banners in the wind, of a woman who had once asked if men could change the fate of a world. He thought of eyes that had looked upon him with a faith he had not earned. For a long moment, the only sound was the far-off shuffling of feet as columns broke into column. Then John raised his head and gave a command. "The eastern column will faint at the east gate," he said. 200 archers and 20 rangers will make that road loud as a smith. The main body will march through the pass by the western ridge, where the ground hides a causeway. The small host, my own, will cross the old ford at first light and move near the ruined watchtower. We will set fire in 3 places so the smoke draws the eye. We will strike where the shadow is thin. How long will your small host hold?" the marshal asked. His voice was a stone of doubt thrown into the plan's clear pond. "As long as needed," John said. He did not speak with certainty, but with the steel of a man who had decided what he would do. There was a sound in the hall then, like the tightening of a bowstring. Men moved to their places. Sentries took up their posts at the gates. A trumpet sounded, low and hopeful, and answered by another from the outer wall. As the first pale fingers of dawn threaded the city, columns of men and riders began to move. From the walls came a folk song that was rough with waking throats. It was a song of leaving, of winter behind, and it rose thin and brave to the pale sky. Horses stamped and blew in the cold. The smell of wet leather and warm blood, of men who would soon be far from their mothers, rose and wrapped the white stones like a shawl. John stood for a moment at the head of one column, the Palantir in its case weighing at his side like a sin. He watched the lords take their leave from the least to the greatest. Each man cast his hope into the wide road. He felt at the back of his skull the paltry, terrible consolation the glass had offered, that there were lines, and they could be read, and that some roads led to places where an enemy flank could be struck. He also felt the voice, still there, a coiled thing that loved to bargain. It would not be silenced. It would prompt and whisper and offer easier paths if he would only look. For a breath, he let himself imagine not marching, but staying for that breath. He understood how easily any man could be unmade. He put that thought away as one might put away a sword that is too sharp for the task at hand. He could not trust the glass beyond its usefulness. He could not let his fear of its lies become a lie itself. He drew a breath that filled his lungs with the open air of the city and turned his face toward the road. "March," he said. His word was small, but it carried like a bell. Men tightened their reins and set their shoulders. A hawk cried from a parapet. Smoke rose in 3 distant vales as fires were lit on signal. The columns broke from the creak of gates and the slither of boots upon the causeway. The great wheel of the world moved, and for a while the only certainty was motion, iron, horse, and the bent will of those who chose to walk into the shadow. They moved as one when the hour came, not by oath alone, but by a cruelty sharpened into discipline. Jon's plan had no room for hesitation. Feints were launched by riders who knew how to vanish in drifting snow, then flash forward in leather and steel. Spears rose in a serried song along the low ridge, 1,000 throats calling the cadence of winter. Arrows knitted the sky into a formless gray. The ground itself seemed to answer their intent, a drumbeat of boot and hoof that made the very air feel like glass. The feints were not tricks for trickery's sake. They were hungry hands pulling at Sauron's gaze. Where the Lord of Barad-dûr had once found delight in the certainty of conquest, now there were small shifting mirrors of confusion. Columns of orcs turned snarling and cruel, only to stumble into ambushes waiting beneath leafless trees. A host of spearmen in fur and hide would appear from ravines and hold the flank until trumpets commanded withdrawal. Each step back bled a piece of the enemy's order away. Each step forward seized a scrap of ground that would not be given again. At the center, where the eye throbbed like a wound, the shield wall stood like a cliff. Men and veterans of other lands locked shields and pressed together, their faces a single stern plane under helms crusted with soot. They were soldiers who had learned the weight of winter upon their bones, who had walked with frost in their lungs and known the price of standing fast. Their shields were scarred and dark, and their hands were steady, because they had nothing left to give but what they already had. The wall did not yield. It groaned and bucked under the assault, but it held the line between the living and the gaze that would have unmade them all. Jon rode along that wall like a sparrow along a wire. He did not boast. He did not seek the trumpet song. He moved with a small, urgent kindness. When a man lagged, Jon's hand found his shoulder and pressed him back to the line. When the cold bit through a gauntlet, Jon slid his own cloak, threadbare and smelling of the north, over a younger soldier's shoulders. The ordinary acts of care were the most dangerous kind of command, for they bound disparate wills to a single purpose without pomp. Men who had sworn their lives to different kings and codes found themselves listening, then following, because there was a man at their middle who remembered winter and mercy in equal measure. Far to the east, Where shadow was nearest home, the bearers of the ring moved like something half of pity and half of doom. They went alone and together, slipping through trenches of blackened earth, making each step a small martyrdom of heart. Their faces were hollowed by the weight of what they carried. They spoke little, for words wasted breath when every breath was taxed. Yet in the hush of their passage, whole armies bent their course. Soldiers who had marched for coin and glory now took off helmets in silence and watched as those small figures passed. Even the fiercest of captains found a hand lifted as if in benediction. It was not the ring doing this, it was the recognition that the world still held such impossible things that even the darkest power must be forced to reckon. The sacrifices were precise as they were terrible. Men who had loved fields and hearths made themselves into wedges and boulders that broke the enemy's lines. They did not die with songs or boast. Their ends were quiet, practical things, blocking a gate until the last, holding a bridge until fresh feet could cross. They stepped into harm because they had once known what it was to live small and unremarked, and they preferred a brief blaze of purpose to a long extinguishing. Snow turned at last to mud at the places they fell. Banners that had borne ancient sigils flapped empty on poles. There was no stage for elegy in that hour, only the long, grinding reckoning of loss and the stubborn business of saving what remained. Once the shield wall held and the feints had scattered much of the enemy's order, the central strike unfolded. Jon ordered a movement that read like a chess combination. Riders who had feigned retreat suddenly wheeled, collars of light and steel closing, while hidden infantry stepped from the tree line to cut the hem of Sauron's host. The bend in the enemy's formation became a break. Men who had stood with him under the gray sky surged through that break like tide over a cliff. Their boots sank in the churned earth, and their swords sang with an ugly, necessary sound. The eye shrieked, if such a thing could shriek, and a wind of flame licked the edges of the battlefield, as if the world itself were trying to cleanse the stain of the living who dared to resist. The true violence of that hour was not in blades, but in the resolving of what it meant to be a people. Old quarrels were buried in the mud. Men of different tongues and colors leaned together, shoulders pressed, breaths shared. More than once, a man saved by another's boot looked up and found a kindred face, and in that glimpse there was a promise made that would not be undone by mere statutes and treaties. Bonds forged in the heat of survival are quick and hard as forged steel. Jon felt that forging in his chest, a slow, painful feeling like the setting of a bone. It hurt. It mended. When the smoke thinned and the first dim star showed above, the field was no place for songs. Countless standards lay broken, dripping with rain and ash. There was no music for them. There were only hands to bury the dead, faces turned toward the sky as if to ask why the sun had not stayed to look upon them. Jon walked that field with a torch in his palm. He did not kneel at each grave. He had no time for such private grief. Instead, he touched helmets. He lifted shields that might be used again. He told those who still stood to remember names and tell them true. The acts were small and human. They were stitches on a torn garment. They were all he could give. The victory was not a clean thing. Sauron's will was not destroyed in an instant. The Black Tower had been wounded, its shape blurred. Many of its servants lay broken and scattered, but the malign presence remained like a bruise on the land, vast in potential, diminished but not ended. The dark dominion had been fractured, its lines broken as a net might tear when caught upon a stone. Lords and captains who once marched unquestioning now hesitated, uncertain whether to bend their knee to another master or to the first council that might arise. The great shadow had been driven to count its costs, and in that counting there was weakness. It was here, among ruin and unspoken promises, that the old lords came to Jon one after another. They did not come with gilded words, nor did they come under banners. They came with hands that trembled and eyes that were alive with weary cunning. They bowed as men bowed when a new king was made in old days, but there was no crown to press upon Jon's head. Instead, there was an offer of a strange and daunting thing: co-governance, shared guardianship. They would keep watch together. They would shape law with many hands. They sought not a single ruler, but a council that could hold what unity had won. Jon listened. He thought of the life he had hoped for, of quiet rooms and the stretch of snow beyond a door. He had come here with a simplicity of heart, to right a wrong and then return to smallness. The fields smell, the weight of helmets, the voices of those who could not sleep at night because grief gnawed. These things pushed that simplicity away. He had seen what unity could do. He had seen strangers become a single instrument and cut a god's hand. He had learned unity's terrible lesson. It could defeat a god, but it burned away the simple illusions that had once warmed him. So Jon did not turn his back on the world he had saved. He made a choice that was not a triumphal coronation, but a vow of labor. He agreed to remain, not as a king cloaked in gold, but as steward of a fragile peace. He would help build the delicate architecture of a shared rule. Those who once would not speak his name now place their trust in him, not blindly, but because he had asked for nothing that was not offered back. He would travel between ruined halls and half-rebuilt towns, listen to disputes that reeked of old grievance, and learn to stitch them with laws that did not crush the small freedoms he had wrested free. The rebuilding would be slow and sometimes cruel in its patience. Roads must be cleared, farms had to be replanted. The laws of trade and harvest needed forging anew so that men would not die of hunger a year hence. Outposts must be manned along the borders where shadow still whispered. Scouts would ride into lands browned by war, not to hunt, but to learn where quiet nests of evil might yet resurge. Jon took each thing with a cautious hand, like a man handling a lit coal, knowing that one wrong move could set the whole field afire again. He kept for himself one solitary task that would mark his return to the north. At dawn, he climbed the ruined gate of a once grand keep and looked northward where the land grew thin and hard. He would send men there to stand as sentries between the world he had saved and the wild that had birthed his first name. He would not be gone from that watch. He would stand among them and lend his presence to a line of sentinels whose faces would be stern enough to dissuade those who would test the peace. It was not a throne, but it was a thing that needed doing, and Jon had learned that some callings were found, not chosen. As the first council met beneath a battered tent, voices rose and fell like tides. They argued of taxes, of roads, of the reseeding of orchards, of how to honor those who had fallen without turning their loss into exploitation. They spoke with a rough civility. They negotiated with the fragile courage of people who had seen what a single man's malice could do. They fashioned small laws with careful, deliberate strokes, aware that a single heavy hand could undo everything they had bled for. Jon sat among them, sleeves rolled, eyes tired. He listened and spoke rarely. When he spoke, men turned to him, and not out of fear. They turned because his words had weight, and weight here was measured by endurance. He laid before them a map worn at the edges and asked that the north road be mended first. He requested sentries for the passes. He proposed a yearly gathering where law would be sung aloud in every tongue, so that people might know what they were bound to and why. Each proposal was a stepping stone, not a settling. Each was a motion toward something that had to be built, not simply declared. Outside the tent, the wind began again to sift snow into the open. It whispered across the field where banners had fallen and where fresh stakes had been driven to hold up new cloth. The night would be long and the work longer. Jon rose then, not in drama, but in small resolve. He clipped a strip cloth from an old standard and tied it to his arm, crude and unadorned. He did not raise it to the crowd to command their cheer. Instead, he walked to a cluster of men who had once stood with him and said only, "We stand watch." They answered with nods, and that answer became the first act of a new covenant. There was no triumphal march. There was only a march forward, slow, steady, and burdened toward a day when peace might be more than a fragile rumor. Jon stepped from the tent into the cold and began the first walk of a long duty, and the path ahead waited, not empty, but full of purpose.